All right, guys, we're going to start now. Everybody ready?
Yeah.
Welcome, everyone.
Welcome, everyone. I would like to, before I give to our brilliant facilitator, Lisa, I'm going to just explain a little bit of who is Shine, what are we doing, and also what the webinar is all about. And so my name is Mela, Mela Chiponda. I'm the director of Shine, and I'm an ecological feminist and a climate and energy advocate. I come from a long history of organizing in the extractives, And this webinar is being organized by Shine and our friends. Shine is the Shine Collab is a feminist women's rights focused organization that is working on renewable energy, decentralized renewable energy and climate. And we see energy as an enabler of gender equality, but also believe that it is not all. So the Shine Collab is bridging the divide, and we are dedicated to making the just transition real and transformative. The Shine Collab promotes gender just energy solutions that change the systems and structures at the root of the climate and inequality crisis. And therefore, we have 5 goals: supporting Africa-based women-led small-scale enterprises and grassroots organizations. And by women-led small enterprises, we are actually looking at the women-led power enterprises, which enable women to have access and control of renewable energy in order to promote livelihoods, safety, well-being, and build their collective power to influence a better future. And secondly, we combine knowledge, networks, and financing in support of frontline gender-just energy solutions and leadership, forging cross-sectoral partnerships across the gender justice, feminist, climate, and energy sectors. And we shape the field and change the narratives that currently focus on large-scale top-down energy and climate solutions using data and knowledge from practice to make the case of community-driven, women-led energy and climate alternatives. And we promote a gender-just power-building approach to the just energy transition in policy and practice that challenges the ongoing impact of extractives and fossil fuels and promote people-centered alternatives. And those are our main goals. And our approach is actually rooted in building transformative partnerships, bringing together the feminist movement, women's rights organizations, the climate sector, as well as the energy sector. And now I'm going to leave this time to our brilliant facilitator, Lisa Van Klassen, to lead us in the process. Thank you.
Thanks, Mela. I don't know about brilliant, but we've got a lot of brilliant people on the webinar and a lot of great speakers today. Welcome again to Power to the People, a gender-just energy transition and why it matters. So as Mela said, we're going to really focus in on the role of communities and community-centered approaches to the just energy transition. So transitioning from fossil fuels and an extractive economic model could not be more urgent. All of us are experiencing, wherever we live, floods, droughts. It's clear that climate change is impacting so many communities and our lives, and is so related to other economic and political crises that are affecting people and the planet. So the conversation about transitioning from fossil fuels, it could not be more urgent. So what does a just transition mean? And that's what we're going to talk about. There are a lot of different definitions and many actors with competing interests and competing narratives. And so it's easy to forget that just transition originally came from movement organizers dealing with the harms left behind and caused by phasing out of coal mining. And it was really a call to action by labor unions, environmental justice groups, indigenous organizations that subsequently has been reshaped by feminist organizers and activists of all kinds. But the original version really is a set of principles, processes and practices for strategies intended to build economic and political power to shift from an extractive to a regenerative economy. And we're going to go back to that a little bit today in our conversation. So a just transition will clearly take all of us and many different approaches, and a major role for finance, for governments, financial institutions, and civil society. But with a current emphasis on more top-down technocratic approaches, where technology is the solution and energy companies are playing a much more dominant role in conversations about just transition, this conversation really aims to put people, power, and justice back at the center of the conversation about just transition. So when I say power, I really, from an energy perspective, I'm thinking of electricity and ending energy poverty, which particularly affects the African continent. But limited and unreliable and expensive energy access is a problem in many, many parts of the world. So that's one form of power that we're going to talk about. But the other form of power that we're going to think about when we think about the role of communities is the messy political context and contests and conflicts that characterize crises and transitions. These are times when competing interests are very much at play. And when we're thinking about power, it's really about whose interests and voices count most, whose rights are respected, who decides, and what solutions are valued. And these aren't minor questions for how a just transition occurs or whether or not it succeeds. So in just 2 hours, we are going to talk through a lot of concrete examples of the ways that communities are involved and affected from Zimbabwe to Kentucky, because always context matters. And we will look at the connections with policy processes, particularly development and climate policy. So we're really excited to have an amazing group of speakers. We will go back to Mela Chiponde, who's the executive director of Shine to start, and then we'll hear from John Gaventa, who's a scholar on power at the Institute for Development Studies, who's been really looking at power and just transition. And then we will go to South Africa with Makoma Lekalakala, and then to Bridget Burns, who's the director of the Women's Environment and Development Organization, to connect the dots between climate and community-centered energy and climate justice solutions. We will go to Sheila Aparacha, who's the director of Energia and one of the leading voices on energy and development policy, particularly on the Sustainable Development Goals. And finally, with Jackie Patterson, whose long history connecting climate, gender, racial justice, and fostering self-determination with community-centered approaches is widely known. So without further ado, I'm going to start with an invitation to Mela. And Mela and I know each other from feminist movement organizing. And our paths crossed when we both began looking at feminist approaches to a just transition around 2015. And it was only later that I learned that actually Mela has a PhD in renewable energy. So it's really an amazing opportunity for the Shine CoLab to have her in leadership. So to understand just transition and a gender just transition, let's get really concrete. So Mela, talk to us about from your experience, what are some of the examples of women-driven, community-controlled climate and energy justice approaches? And why does gender matter? And more importantly, let's stay focused on the work that you're doing with Shine in Bikita, Zimbabwe, on the edge of one of the largest lithium deposits in the world, to help bring to light the idea of a community-driven energy transition. Mela?
Thank you very much, Lisa. And I would like to say, someone said it is supposed to be actually a just transformation. What we need is a transformation. And the person who say that is going to elaborate on that, because that is John, who said we need a transformation. And Lisa, you know, the question that is often asked when I go out in communities, particularly in Bikita, when you want to start the discussion on just transition or energy transition, the first question they ask you is, what are we transitioning from? And that question does not come from the privileged. It comes from the most disadvantaged in society, because they don't have access. They don't have access to energy. They are marginalized in a lot of ways. Their vulnerabilities are actually intersecting. And therefore, when we talk about transitioning, they ask you, what are we transitioning from? Because what they need first is access before they can say, we are going to go through a transition. And therefore, for me now, the question is, are we not supposed to talk about a whole transformation? Because when we look at the energy sector, and I know that the dominant idea about how we are going to address this climate crisis or the ecological crisis is through energy transitions. And that, when we talk about energy transitions, we are actually talking about a space and a discussion that a lot of corporations and a lot of people with power are comfortable with, because that solution, as much as we need to transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy, we need to center justice. And when we just talk about an energy transition without talking about the justice part, and without looking at the context in which these transitions are going to happen, then we are missing a very critical point. And I mentioned earlier when I was introducing Shine that we see energy access as part of what can promote gender equality, but it is just but one of the things, of the many variables that can lead to gender equality. And amongst a lot of things that need to be addressed, that would actually ensure that we have gender equality. And now I want to look at this transition that is happening across the world, and maybe just referring a little bit to the closure of coal mines in South Africa, that I know Makoma is going to really focus on, that we have seen how South Africa is part of the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, or the Energy Transition Partnerships, and how they are closing down the coal mines, and how women are suffering and people are suffering. But let us look at what is needed for that energy transition to happen. And that is what is most critical, right? Now, Zimbabwe is a country that is sitting on the largest lithium deposits on the continent. And this is a very critical mineral in the renewable energy sector. And it is needed for the energy transition. But then let us look at the context in which this lithium mining is taking place. Lithium mining in Zimbabwe started in the 50s in Bikita, which is, firstly, let us look at it. It is a rural place. It is a rural district. And then secondly, when I was asking the women, when I visited Bikita, I was asking the women, do you know what lithium is used for? They said, no, we don't. but we don't like what is going on. We don't like the devastation on our environment. We don't like the pollution on our rivers. We don't like losing our land to what we don't know, right? It's not because the people in Bikita are against renewable energy. No way. They also love energy. They need also energy justice. They are living in extreme energy poverty where they just have access to the very basic of access to just lighting in most cases. But they have quite a lot of energy needs. When I was discussing with the women about what is your understanding of power, people were talking about, the physical power, the power that they get from the sun, the power that they get from the rivers, from the flowing of water that they get from the wind. And they use energy every day. The power that they get from their ox-drawn plows and all that. And now the justice part also comes into play when we reduce people who have solid understanding of what energy is, of what power is, to be just consumers without allowing them to define what kind of energy system they want, what kind of energy technologies that they require, that we reduce them to just being consumers of who knows who makes those decisions. And now bringing in the issue of the climate crisis, and I'm not going to take long because I know that we have a lot of brilliant people. Bringing in the issue of the climate crisis, Zimbabwe is sitting on one of the most devastating droughts in the country. It is said we haven't faced anything like this for the past 40 years. And when we hear communities talk about, if only we had access to solar-powered boreholes, we could have, harvested even more. When women talk about, if we had some lighting, some solar lighting, we could feel more safe. If we could have access to lighting in our healthcare centers, we could have an improvement in our maternal health care, in our antenatal and postnatal care. It means they understand what is needed, but the challenge is that they cannot talk about a transition when they don't have access because they have nothing to transition from. But what is problematic with the ongoing global energy transition? The problem is that the most vulnerable groups who are indigenous, who are peasants, who are the working class, are carrying the burden of the energy transition. And this energy transition, the dominant thinking about the energy transition is that they only look at it as a technological transition, that, hey, we are going to, change and close down the Wankie Colliery, which is more than 100 years. And we are going to extract our lithium and have batteries, and then we can have renewable energy. We can harvest our solar. But they're just looking at changing the fossil fuels-driven electricity system to ensure that the people who have right now can continue having access to electricity. And nobody is talking about the energy poverty of the people who are hosting the lithium deposits, who are struggling with the severe impacts of the extraction of lithium. They are not thinking about the plight of the women in Bikita who are having to live with pollution and other environmental harms that are caused by lithium extraction. And therefore, we cannot talk about a just transition without involving the people who are directly impacted by the energy transition. And we cannot recreate extractivism through energy transitions. We cannot push for decarbonization extractivism in the name of we have to have renewable energy. Thank you so much, Lisa. I'm going to give back to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mela, for taking us to the Kita and some of these concrete examples that are so important. You know, it's this idea of not just decarbonizing, taking fossil fuels out of the energy economy. It's the idea of democratizing the energy economy, including a lot of discussion of making energy and access to energy a right. So now we're going to go to John Gaventa. Hi, John. From the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex, who is a very a well-known scholar on power and participation, and the co-author of a forthcoming book on power and just transition. And for those of you who know my work on power with Jazz Just Associates, John is my original source, and someone that I've known for many, many years, and our source scholar, and an important ally for a lot of activists. John, you and your colleagues at IDS have looked at a range of just transition processes from the lens of power and voice, identifying how people are affected and engaged in just transition and what difference it makes. In fact, the origins of your work in coal country makes this a subject of a lifetime inquiry and something you've gone back to 50 years later. So what are some of the insights from the examination of just transition processes that you and your colleagues have been involved in? And what have you learned about power from this and from your return to Kentucky?
Thank you, Lisa. It's a great privilege to be part of this incredible panel today. Thank you for inviting me. And I'll share some of the research, as Lisa said, that we've been doing at the Institute of Development Studies in partnership with many colleagues in Africa and elsewhere. Let's go to slide 1, if we can. Mela has pointed to the immense importance of achieving a just transition, especially for African women. Indeed, the world is calling for such a transition. But when the Paris Agreement on climate change was agreed at COP21 in 2016, the phrase just transition was used only once. But by COP27 in Glasgow in 2021, only 6 years later, the phrase was everywhere. It's now become part of the global discourse on development. But while the phrase just transition is now being widely used, we also have to ask, whose version of justice are we talking about? And as Mela's already pointed out, what kind of transition are we talking about? It's a highly contested area. It's an area of power struggles. Now at IDS, we've been doing a great deal of research on just transitions and how to strengthen community voices in the debate. One of our recent reports is called Voices of Injustice, looks at some of these struggles for just transition around the world and points to a number of conclusions. I'll quickly share a few. Next slide, please. First, as Mela said so clearly and already, for just transition to be meaningful and sustainable, it needs to be grounded in the lived experience of those on the front line of energy transition. But while discourses and programs for just transition have emerged globally, thus far, little attention has been paid to the voices and knowledge of communities most directly affected, especially of women from the global South. But the history of development has shown us that without listening to these lived experiences from below, top-down models of change are rarely inclusive, just, or indeed sustainable. Secondly, we need to recognize that the struggles for just energy transition begin on an uneven playing field. Again, as Mela's pointed out, involving multiple historical inequalities and injustice. In Africa, these include the economic inequalities found in the history of an extractivist economy, the legacy of environmental environmental injustice, often left by extractive economies, with significant consequences for women's work and livelihoods, the energy inequalities seen in the lack of access to electricity, the global climate inequalities as the poorest communities are at the front line of the effects of climate change, despite being the lowest carbon emitters. These inequalities are also deeply embedded in histories of colonialism and patriarchy, which in turn reinforce norms and practices of racial and gender inequality. I was raised in the Niger Delta in Nigeria, and over 50 years ago, when I was there, Shell had already begun its extraction. But the right of Shell to extract that land was given under laws that had been made under colonial times. So we can't divorce where we are now in terms of the crisis from this history of inequality and power within Africa. Now, given these uneven and unequal starting points, strategies that seek to achieve a just and inclusive energy transition have to be joined up. They have to take a multi-sectoral approach, which links the struggles for economic, environmental, energy, climate, racial, and gender justice. The movement for just transition, therefore, offers a big umbrella for groups who have often worked separately to now come together. And in fact, it's critical that we do. But in this process, we must recognize, as Lisa and Mel have also said, transition is not simply the technical process of moving from one form of energy power to another, but more fundamentally, it's about how we challenge and transform the forms of social, economic, political, and ideological power upon which the fossil fuel industry is built. To do this, we must also then ask the question, whose definition are we talking about? Academic literature refers to a number of forms of justice. These include distributional justice, about who wins and who loses, who gains from this transition, who's going to profit from it. Procedural justice, who participates, who's involved at the table. Recognitional justice, whose voices and whose knowledge matter. Restorative justice, which means addressing the inequalities of the past, not just thinking to the future. And global financial justice, who's going to pay the bill to make this transition. Each of these, who wins, who participates, whose knowledge, whose history, who pays, are themselves about power. And to address them requires new forms of power analysis and new forms of power informed action. As we engage communities in the struggle, we also have to start by listening to their priorities and ask what version of justice, what kind of transition do they want? As Mela said, so far these definitions have mainly been northern driven and very top down. For instance, in working with partners in the Niger Delta, we asked women there what a just transition should mean. And they talk the need first to clean up the legacies of the damaged lands, water, and livelihoods that decades of oil extraction has left behind. Before we think about a transition to the future, they say, let's clean up the past. For them, restorative justice was most important. When we asked women in rural Mozambique about their dreams for transition, we got the same answer that Mela did with the women in Zimbabwe. We don't have electricity in the first place, so how can we transition to something else? For them, just getting access to affordable, clean energy would represent an important first step towards justice. So in order to hear these voices and priorities, we need new strategies for engagement of women and girls and others in the just transition debate. Our report, which you can download, calls for the need for several strategies. New slide, please. First, we need to amplify the voices from below. We need to find ways to lift up the women's narratives and the women's stories to enter this debate. Secondly, we need to create and engage in spaces where decisions are being made. So far, there's not a lot of public consultation about these decisions at the local level. Most of it's national and global. And where there's very little involvement of people on the front lines of energy transition. Where we can't enter those invited spaces, we need to figure out ways to create our own fora, create our own spaces like you're doing today. And thirdly, we need to create alliances that link voices across these struggles for climate, energy, economic, gender, and other forms of justice. We've come to think about these three strategies as an ecosystem of transformation with different levers and different entry points that groups can use to propel action. I don't have time to go into all the strategy today, but please look at the link in the chat for the executive summary, which will list 7 key strategies that we found working for people around the world. So let's shift to a different context. Let me share by sharing a story from my own background. As Lisa mentioned, some 50 years ago, as a young student in my home state, I worked as an activist researcher in a remote coal mining valley in the United States, one of the poorest parts of rural America. From that experience, I wrote a book called Power and Powerlessness, which traced the development of power relations as the land was taken over there from the farmers and local community by a British company that also owned land in Zimbabwe. And they exercised control, top-down control, very strong control and power for over 100 years. But today, these mines are gone. Just like in South Africa, they're closing. So now the question is, what happens to power when the material base on which it is built, in this case coal, closes? What happens to power when the mines close? To answer these questions, a colleague and I have returned to the same valley where I worked 50 years ago, and to examine how power changes in the midst of transition. The results are fascinating, and I don't have time to go into all of them here, but let me share a few highlights. In a historically deprived area, the closure of the mining industry has left in its wake even greater inequality, poverty, joblessness, and destruction that was there before. So as I've said, any approach to just transition in these communities has to start by recognizing the legacy of historical injustice to achieve any sense of justice in the future. With these changes also come changes in power dynamics. Now, when the mines close, the old power holders, the elites associated with the coal industry and their politicians and friends and allies, they don't just go away. They struggle to cling on to power, often through increased harassment and backlash of those who are now demanding accountability, or with new narrative power trying to delay and discredit the notion that we're facing a climate crisis in the first place. At the same time as old power holders hold on, as again Mela has said in Zimbabwe, new investors rush in to grab land for new minerals, or in a new mechanism to take over the forest to sell the forest carbon to distant carbon makers, carbon markets, a very misunderstood and not very transparent form of profit, with little benefits coming back to local communities, and oftentimes increasing the exclusion of people from their traditional lands. These new actors and new forms of extraction simply risk replicating the inequalities of the past, not changing them. But on the other hand, the decline of these old forms of power creates new spaces for new forms of mobilization from below, as communities struggle now both to reclaim their past, but also demand a new future. In the region I study, these new spaces, these new opportunities as old power declines, has oftentimes been occupied by women leaders and women's organizations who are trying to build new, more sustainable, caring, and restorative economies than the extractive economy of before. With this shift comes the need for a new kind of power, what Just Associates have called the Power For. That is the ability to articulate a vision of where we want to go based on the experiences and voices from below. Building a collective vision for a just transition grounded in the lived experience of women in Africa and elsewhere is critical for building the just transition movement. So what this small valley where I know in my own home is experiencing is not unique. In fact, it reflects the changing power dynamics in the process of transition writ large. A development model based on natural resource extraction and the systems of colonial power which have supported it for centuries affects thousands of such places around the world, in Africa, Asia, Latin America. But this model is now being challenged by the urgency of climate change. The transition from the past to an unknown future, as one order gives way to another, opens up the necessities and spaces for contesting power and claiming a new future. And we see this around the world as social movements demand environmental and climate justice, as communities and workers seek new forms of decentralized energy production and control. So it's an exciting time with enormous potential for change. But the fundamental questions still remain. Whose justice will predominate in this transition? Who will be the winners? Whose voices will be heard? Whose knowledge will be counted? Whose history and futures will prevail? At this historical moment, it's critical that the voices and visions of women at the front lines of change are brought to the fore, and that they gain the power to shape their vision of justice for the future. So thanks to Shine, thanks to all of you for the work you're doing to address this enormous opportunity and challenge of our times. Thank you.
Thanks so much, John. There's so much juice there that resonates with so many of us, and a perfect way to turn to you, Makoma. Just by way of introduction, we're very lucky to have Makoma Lekalakala, who is a longtime environmental and justice activist rooted in the liberation struggle against apartheid in South Africa. And the co-recipient of the Goldman Environmental Prize in 2018 for your work on the first South African climate change legal case, as someone who's on the Presidential Climate Commission, advising the South Africa, and now the founder and head of EarthLife Africa. So, South Africa is the first, what is called a JETP country, right? Which is a lot. The Just Energy Transition Partnerships, which is what JESP stands for, are intergovernmental partnerships intended to provide financial and technical support, mainly from countries in the global north, to emergent economies that produce and consume coal on a large scale. And South Africa is the first. So as someone who has spent many, many years organizing and working with communities to be heard and to be counted in environmental and energy justice struggles in South Africa, how has South Africa's JETP process impacted communities? What kinds of new collaborations are happening? Who is being left out, and how are communities organizing? Makoma, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's an honor for me to be part of this discussion, and I will try to share as much as I can, and particularly from a personal perspective. But just a correction, I'm not a founder of EarthLife. I happen to lead this activist environmental justice organization. EarthLife was founded long ago, before I even came into the picture. According to the Just Transition Framework, which was adopted by the South African Cabinet in 2022, this is the document that the Presidential Climate Change Commission came up with after extensive consultations in different communities and also with different sectors of the South African society. The framework says a just transition for South Africa must ensure that the transition to a low carbon economy is conducted in a way that serves to address present and historical inequality, create jobs, relieves poverty, restores our natural systems to build a resilience, and critically, that it does not leave anyone behind. The South African transition is being designed and implemented in real time as we speak now. And as per the framework, no one should be left behind. And this transition, it's driven particularly not only for South Africa, but also we understand that there's cumulative impacts from the region of the climate change induced natural disasters. We've experienced a lot of them from Durban, from Kariega recently, the droughts in the Northwest Province, and other provinces, including the pollution in areas like the Highveld or Mpumalanga area and the Vaal area, where we find that people are struggling to breathe. This driver, the climate change-induced natural disasters, are the drivers why this transition from business as usual, particularly on how the country generates electricity, is urgent. And this transition is happening. But is it quick enough? Is it addressing some of what the Just Transition Framework said it should address? And these are the questions that we have, and this is the situation that we are faced with. One important thing is that the path to this transition must be rooted in justice. And I think this is where this discussion today is located in, that gender justice principles must be at the fore of the transition. This means taking into consideration the legacy of gender discrimination and its effect into society, as well as the realities of the care burden of women in society. And our belief is that a just transition will be just if it has women, non-binary people, and LGBTI people at the center of decision-making to shape and be part of the implementation of how this transition should take place. A gender lens into all aspects of developing, shaping, and implementation process is what will bring about a just transition. And this is where we're struggling. And this is what has been raised, and not only by community-based organizations. This has not only been raised by the labor formations in the country, because there is that gap that people feel that they are not involved, and there's aspects that are not taken into consideration of. And there is so much focus on the just energy transition, which focuses more on the macro energy generation. And this narrative of the just energy transition is problematic in that it only focuses on macro energy issues and leaves out ordinary people who are seldom or often not part of the policy space where they can shape a way forward, taking into consideration their circumstances. Many would argue that there's adequate planning for the transition, but this has fallen out as there are gaps that are not, prioritized. Procedural justice, because not everyone is involved, and this has come up when the Presidential Climate Commission has got consultations in different communities, that in particular people in Mpumalanga, where there is that focus, are not even aware or familiar with what is happening or what needs to be done. And there's a likelihood that the restorative justice would not be adequately be addressed. And the holistic approach of new forms of jobs, decarbonizing transport, for an example, of reuse and repurposing of the infrastructure for decarbonized energy generation, ordinary people are not involved. And obviously, if ordinary people are not involved, there is a likelihood that the justice factor is not being added to. There's a number of projects in Mpumalanga around the Highveld area. This is the home of coal, where there's a lot of coal-fired power stations and also coal mines. And the town of Emalahleni has become a hive of activity. And that hive of activity comes from the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan that South Africa got from the international partners that include the European Union, that include Germany, France, and Denmark, for an example. And we find that most of the concentration, part of what this Just Energy Transition projects in Mpumalanga, we find that they are done at much more of a higher level. And most of the people on the ground continuously ask as to what really is happening. And it's just a shame. It's an irony that a process that is supposed, or that is intended to be supportive of the transition, or the just transition, it's a process that actually also brings much more confusion. And how we see that is that the international partners group have got their own interest, and their own interests are more like, what is that they want to advance? For an example, what we hear now lately around the repurposing of some of the coal-fired power stations, it's around projects of green hydrogen, projects around small nuclear modular reactors. And this is what people have not been involved in. People have not been involved in the discussions as to what form of alternative energy would you want to see in this place. And that we see this as a form of a new energy colonialism, as there was no consultation with workers, with communities around those areas. It's just a top-down approach to say, this is what we are bringing to this community. This is what we think is good for you. And unfortunately, the provincial government, the municipal government are also working with the international partners group. And you can understand that's the power of money that comes in. And this is the power that disregards whether there's going to be environmental degradation, whether is there going to be biodiversity loss with the new form of alternative, so-called alternative energy that is brought into the area. And this also brings a question to us to say, who are the winners and who are the losers? And this time, we see that it's still a continuation, that the winners are going to be the international partners group and may not be the local people. And this is some of the stuff that we're struggling with, particularly with the closure of Komati, which actually was not a just transition project. The plant was supposed to be decommissioned, but then it was turned into that. And even Eskom has acknowledged that there is a lot of things that they didn't do right. But with that, we are aware, and the people have been working for quite a long time, particularly women. And the work done by local organizations for a number of years of showcasing socially owned renewable energy. We have the communities in Mpumalanga, in Emalahleni, where they have set up a showcase place to say this is how renewable energy would pan out in our communities. So people use the center in the center of town in a community to do a variety of things by using solar power. Earthlife has worked for a number of years, I think from about 2011, when we're trying to showcase what alternatives are there, that we can move away from a centralized energy generation to a decentralized, socially owned renewable energy. And the comrades have done that, the women have done that by setting up what they call sustainable energy and livelihood projects in schools, which are also used as community centers. And at these community centers, they installed solar, they installed they built biodigesters, they had water, or had micro gardens that the women would work on, and then the harvest would go towards a feeding scheme in the school. So we started this in schools, but then the women had to expand the project to go into household. as people are being given the narrative that solar does not work, renewable energies would not assist in resolving the problems that we have. And we have already installed in about 8 households where we have 5 kilowatt of solar. And these households of women, this is showcasing that people can be able to get energy from the renewable energy. And this is in line to also say to people, this would be good if, because this is going to assist them to access energy as per the Sustainable Development Goal. So with this, what women are bringing up, it helps in a sense that people are able to engage at a policy level to say, this is what is working, this is what is helping me, this is what we can get for the community, and also checking up on the carbon footprint of that, because the carbon footprint is much lesser than that of a coal-fired power station, and the externalized costs are much are lower than those that are at a coal-fired power station. But what is important is that the gender lens of looking into this, the gender lens into looking into the just transition, it's very important, and not only for it helps so that everyone can be part of shaping, as long as women are not part of designing, as long as women are not part of deciding on what the future should look like, then this transition is not going to be just, and we should not call it a just transition. We should call it a just transition from business as usual to business as usual. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Makoma, for all of that. It really brings to light the importance of what a gender just approach is, and addressing the legacy of gender discrimination, as you said, and centering not only the burden of care, but centering care in the future regenerative economy and all of the potential for decentralized energy sources in schools, in health clinics, in communities, and how that is a critical complementary piece in, and the importance of the role of women. We're going to turn now to Bridget Burns, the Executive Director of the Women's Environment and Development Organization, an organization that has been at the forefront of connecting climate, economic, and environmental issues as a women's rights and feminist issue since 1993, right? Or 94 with the Rio conference, when Bella Abzug, Vandana Shiva, Wangari Maathai, prominent early leaders led the charge on many of these issues. And Bridget helped connect the dots between the gender just energy transition, community-based climate and energy solutions, and climate policy. Where are we?
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Lisa. And what a rich conversation this has been so far. I'm so grateful to be thinking through and talking and building on what has been laid forward of why it is so critical that we have a just transition, that we have a gender just transition, why it matters, and how energy is so prominent in that space. And I'm going to zoom out just a little bit to the broader context, as Lisa said, of climate policy, which is a space in which we as a women's rights advocacy organization really occupy alongside other grassroots feminist advocates, Indigenous women, to try to intervene into that policy space, which is driving so much potential change, and where there is a distinct possibility, as has been mentioned here, that a transition will happen, but it will by no means be assuredly just. And so I wanted to start actually with an image. My work within the global climate policy framework didn't necessarily start with Paris, but I think Paris and 2015 in general, where we also saw the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals was a particularly important time in history for really kind of an acceptance that we are somewhere on the brink of shifting away from a fossil fuel era. I remember laying down in front of the Eiffel Tower. I was the one in the 100% renewable energy message that we were sending as a message from Paris, from the Paris Agreement. And, I share also here, since then, not only at COP 21 in 2015, but since then, every year, we hear of both the stark reality of what science is telling us in the IPCC reports of the absolute urgent need to shift away from fossil fuels, the declaration that each of these conventions is heralding the end of the fossil fuel era, and also the enormous amounts of new initiatives, bilateral, multilateral initiatives that are about creating energy efficiency, a renewable energy renaissance in countries and continents around the world, usually, based upon a transition of wealth and a redistribution of power that is both, in one sense, obviously key to the equity principles that we fight for from a climate justice perspective across communities, but is deeply alarming in the ways in which there is a potential for a very strong neocolonialism around energy in the way that it's transitioned and who owns and who accesses it. So just around the time that in 2015, there was this real surge in this is the moment where we shift our energy systems, many of us started to really think through for whom, for what, what energy, for who, and by who. And so one of the reports that is from 2016, but still stands really strong today, that we started dreaming up with partners from ActionAid, Friends of the Earth, and others who were working on the ground with grassroots communities and thinking about what were the challenges and pitfalls for energy access, was thinking about how do you actually deliver on the promise of decentralized, community-controlled renewable energy access. The science is telling us that this transition is needed. We need to change the energy sources that we use, and drastically we need energy consumption to shift. But of course, that energy consumption is not equal. We're also existing in a world around the Sustainable Development Goals where we're dealing with energy poverty and a need to be able to access energy that is deeply gendered as well. That is not just cutting across countries, but cutting across within communities as well. And so the premise of understanding how do we really bring about this transition, understanding the context of inequalities that currently exist, led us to at least two preconditions for what a just and sustainable future would actually require. That universal energy access is based on sustainable forms of renewable energy, and that energy is under the control of the communities living in poverty that are meant to be the beneficiaries, that we are thinking about communities and decentralized community access. And so this report looked into 4 principles for what an approach to decentralized renewable energy access would look like. That we were talking about energy sufficiency, so that energy access should be defined in a way that ensures people have access to enough energy for a full and dignified life. We were talking about decentralized and subsidiary, so that this was about ownership and control and decision-making over the production of energy. And it should be devolved to a local level as much as possible. That it's gender responsive, so that energy access must ensure all people have equal participation in the value chain of energy planning. So much of what Makoma was sharing is missing from, and we are seeing that in this onslaught of initiatives that are happening. One of the most immediate pitfalls that we see in these initiatives is the lack of deep consultation and consent in what these energy solutions should look like, and who is involved in that. The gender responsive piece is also taking into account the gender division of labor and power, resulting in these specific needs and abilities of folks in communities. And then finally, that environmental and social sustainability and respect for human rights is integral to how we are developing these energy solutions. So only appropriate technologies should be part of needs assessments for how we mitigate and adapt to the climate crisis. Technologies that pose minimal risk to the climate, environment, and local communities, and with the full buy-in and accountability to those communities. And so this messaging for over, for almost a decade at this point is something that as global policy advocates, we have been trying to influence into the policy space of climate change, to understand how do we actually make these shifts. And there's a number of challenges to this, and I think a number of opportunities. And it leads me to why I think this webinar, partnerships like Shine, are actually what the solution, part of what the solution is, because this is fundamentally about breaking silos. This is about understanding not just what is energy, what's the gendered dimensions of energy access, for example. It's about understanding what is delivering on a gender just transition. And that requires having a very systemic understanding of both inequalities and what it would take to actually transition and transform in the ways that John has been talking about power and who has access and control. And that is much more than a simple mainstreaming project, I think, as we all know. And so some of the things that pose great challenges to really shifting and understanding towards delivering on a gender just energy transition start with the finance mechanisms that we currently have to finance climate action, a lot of which are multilateral, some of which are bilateral, but they're almost always not fit for purpose for delivering decentralized community-based renewable energy systems. They are much more top down. They are much more about what is the largest project that we can invest in. The applicability of resources is often a barrier because the entry point to be able to access those resources is so high. And so this is analysis that many groups have been doing, and collaborations such as Shine, and we have initiatives like the Gender Just Climate Solutions Scale Fund, which is work that the Women and Gender constituency of the UNFCCC have been leading on for many years, trying to develop our own model for what gender responsive climate solutions would look like and criteria, and really advocating with donor governments, advocating with corporate partners, private sector partners who are interested in thinking about gender and energy and their intersections with climate, that these are the criteria you would need to be thinking about that goes well beyond just how do you create more opportunities for women in your current energy projects if they are not actually tackling ownership, if they're not tackling what is happening at a community level, and how do you understand power at that community level. Technical capacity. Oh, sorry, I also meant to mention here we're part of a new campaign called Roots Rising, which is also about how do we just generate more resources at this intersection and show the diversity at which funding can be delivered through multiple channels in order to get where it needs to go. Because yes, we want to shift the current finance mechanisms so that they are more able to be applicable to delivering a greater diversity of scale of energy projects, such as many of the examples that have been shown here. But we also recognize that that is not going to happen at the urgency that we need to combat the current crisis that we're facing. And so where there are multiple new and innovative delivery channels, such as through environmental funds, through collaborations of organizations and institutions that can maybe deliver resources at the scale that is actually needed at community level. There's a challenge with technical capacity, which is also related to the corporate capture of pieces, but policymakers tend to be really lacking in understanding the regulatory environment needed to support decentralized models of energy. Some of the ways that we try to combat this is through innovative partnerships, such as with the Climate Technology Centers and Network under the UNFCCC. This is hosted by UNEP, the UN Environmental Program, and is one of the main bodies providing technical advice to donor governments, to governments in general, on how to develop their technologies and their needs assessments to be able to combat the climate crisis and also meet the targets that they've set for themselves for mitigation, adaptation, et cetera. And so we work very closely with those groups to try to do analysis, such as comparative analyses on cooperative models across different regions and how they could be applicable in other regions. We sit on the Technology Executive Committee as the Women and Gender constituency, trying to bring these lessons, these barriers, and these opportunities into the technical spaces. And we've also helped the CTCN develop a roster of experts, knowing that there are experts working across multiple levels, including community level, who understand what is needed and who need to be considered experts in this, that their countries can go to ask for and to consult with when it comes to understanding technological needs. Part of the other, not just a lack of capacity, but there is also corporate capture of the policy regulatory framework space. The COPs themselves, the presidencies themselves, have become increasingly captured by fossil fuel interests, both national level fossil fuel interests and corporate interests. We see more fossil fuel executives attending these policy spaces than ever before, completely outsizing the participation of civil society and grassroots activists, for example. And so even if we had, when we see that the market solutions or the market models for renewables could, if just left alone, outpace fossil fuels because they are becoming stranded assets and vested interests, the regulatory framework is still being crafted in favor of maintaining business as usual. And this relates to, I think, my last point here, that we have to understand, as mentioned, gender justice to be a very large project of understanding how do we actually combat and shift this framework. So I saw a question in the questions around what are we going to do about interstate investor-state dispute settlement, for example, and that understanding of, okay, even if we have the examples and the projects of a local level decentralized community energy system, if we can't combat at the same time and link up and join together to understand the financial and economic systems and structures that are holding us back from being able to really invest in these solutions, we're not going to be able to create that gender just transition. So I will leave it at that because I know we're really short on time. I would love to chat with all of you for a long time on this, and hopefully we'll have some time in the questions to do that.
Thanks so much, Bridget. There's so much here, and it really really emphasizes the importance of the collaboration between community organizers and policy advocates and donors and other kinds of collaborations that combine technical know-how with know-how on the ground. So now we're going to move, and I'm just conscious of time. We have two more speakers and running out of time. So to Sheila Apparocha, who is the head of Energia International Network on Gender and Sustainable Energy, and who's been a Shine partner from the very, very beginning and really supporting women and community energy entrepreneurs and energy organizers, from cook stoves to solar solar home units for many years, and has lots of experience. And so Sheila, talk to us really from your leading role as an energy and gender advocate in the Sustainable Development Goals. Bridget talks about financing. Talk about what's happening in the global development policy space and what the possibilities are.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Like everyone said before, I'm honored to be sharing the panel with so many colleagues and women that inspire me, and also just a shout out to some of them that I see in our as part of our participants: Ellen, Jane Fonda, Elizabeth Salsky. It's wonderful to be part of this conversation. And to be part of a series of conversations that Shine is becoming renowned in convening and hosting. Lisa, Energia is an older sister to Shine, and we've been a part of your evolution, but that's because we've been there for quite some time. I think we're 2 years younger than we do. But for the past 26 years, we have really been trying to make the case for women-led approaches in the energy sector, both at the community level, at the national level, and at the global level. We work at all these levels because we believe that it's increasing women's collective agencies at all these levels that is really important to reinforce and to support each other. That's really going to make the change. We do this also using a multifaceted approach. We work at implementation and guiding energy programs to be more gender responsive. We assist energy institutions in engendering their work and operations. We work with markets to support women energy entrepreneurs, and we link all these into our advocacy work for gender and energy at the global policy level. Lisa, as you said, since 2015, we have been part of the movement that included, for the first time, by the way, in a development agenda, included energy in the Sustainable Development Agenda. For those of us that have been there for longer, we know that we had no energy in the Millennium Development Goals and in the World Summit on Sustainable Development in South Africa in 2001. We could not discuss energy. It was very contentious. So 2015 was really a milestone where we got energy as an SDG. And within that, what was also important, because we still tend to work in silos and there's more attention to some than others, but we were very proud that we were part of the efforts that contributed to including universal access to clean cooking, so not just electricity, as a separate target to SDG 7 on energy. And the reason being that clean cooking is so essential to women's experiences of energy poverty. Some of you might know that this year, aside from the stocktake that took place at the COP, last year, this year we had the global stocktake of SDG 7, which is the SDG on sustainable energy for all. And in the capacity that Energia holds as the co-chair of the SDG 7 Technical Advisory Group, which is convened by the United Nations Department for Economic and Social Affairs, UNDESA, we participated in the stocktake. And what was clear is that there was consensus that across all the targets of SDG, although progress has been made, we still are not working at a pace that is going to allow us to achieve SDG 7, whether it's on energy efficiency, renewable energy, or energy access. Midway to meeting that, the 2030 targets, we're not there. From Energia's perspective, one of the main reasons for the shortfall is the gender gap in all that we're doing. In 2022, SDG 5 on gender equality and empowerment of women and girls was reviewed, and we were very embarrassed, being part of the movement of getting SDG 7 on the table, to be told by UN Women and others when they were doing a gender assessment of all the SDGs, but also reporting on SDG 5 on the gender equality, that the energy SDG was one of only 6 SDGs without any gender indicator, and was one of the reasons, according to UN Energy, that we're not making much progress. So coming from that, we have been unequivocal in our position that when we're talking about a just and inclusive energy transition, we cannot have this transition if we don't work at the intersection and the nexus between SDG 5 and SDG 7. We also advocate that we have to move beyond energy access, which is what my other speakers have said, to really drive change in women's domestic and economic roles in the K economy, but also in their wealth creation, but also supporting women's in decision-making in the sector. And so, Lisa, you had said that, a just transition looks differently for different people. And within Energia, we say we have a sort of a 5-pillar framework for what a gender just and inclusive energy transition looks like. A lot of what has already been said by our other speakers. But the first for us is to end energy poverty. We feel that this is paramount. We also know that blanket solutions do not work, and that we really need to have an intentional, targeted, leaving no one behind approach that really focuses on increasing women's access. And here I agree with what Bridget said, also control over reliable, affordable, and sustainable energy products and services. According to UN Women, without accelerated progress by 2030, an estimated 341 million women and girls will still lack electricity, with 85% of them residing on the African continent. Again, according to UN Women, universal electricity access could lift 185 million women out of poverty by 2050, and the transition to modern cooking solutions could prevent 6.5 million deaths, with significant health benefits for women who suffer disproportionately from biomass fuel exposure. Furthermore, we advocate that we have to move beyond measuring energy access only in terms of megawatts and kilojoules, and how many mini-grids or solar panels have been disseminated, to actually be intentional in measuring how it has enhanced women's livelihoods, increased their adaptation to climate challenges, and built their resilience. So the first is ending energy poverty. The second, we say, is to scale up. In order to scale up these targeted approaches, we have to increase the investments and the financing for women's businesses. We know that evidence has shown that women-led businesses in local communities, particularly where commercial distribution networks are inadequate or non-existent, that these are very successful models. Yet the Global Off-Grid Lighting Association shows us that less than 13% of off-grid investment goes to female-led companies. So why is this? And here I'd like to speak to actually our fellow women investors. We know that the Gender Smart Investment is $1 billion fund, that women are getting richer, but we find that they're not necessarily investing in women-owned businesses. And I think this needs to change. Examples where we see this has been done is, and where change is happening, where investment is being made in female-led organizations, women-led organizations, are in the work that has been done by Energia, but also in other Shine partners such as Solar Sister and Frontier Markets. An example of the impact that can be reached is if you combine what these three organizations, these three Shine partners have done in less than a decade. They've supported 42,000 women entrepreneurs in Asia and Africa that have delivered energy access to 21 million consumers in low-income communities. And these have supported, smallholder farmers to adapt to climate, to grow their businesses, and to contribute to local economies. Another piece of evidence that I'm very proud that I'm happy to share is the report by 60 Decibels, which is the most comprehensive social impact assessment of the off-grid sector to date. And it surveyed 79,000 consumers. And what it showed is that robust evidence that female-led businesses, as well as locally owned businesses, generate the highest income, are more inclusive, have higher customer satisfaction rate, and see lower customer over-indebtedness. So the evidence is there, and it's a question of redirecting our funding to women businesses. A third area of action that Energia advocates at the SDG platform is for equal opportunities for career advancement in the energy transition that we're seeing. According to the International Labour Organization and the International Energy Agency, the sector continues to be very male-dominated. In the best-case scenario that we have in the renewable energy sector, we only have 22% of women's participation, labor participation, and most of this is in administrative positions and not in managerial positions. Additionally, when we talk about the wage gap, we find that women earn 20% less than their male counterparts, even when skill level difference is accounted for. So we addressing this by encouraging women in STEM education and offering equal pay is one of the areas of actions that we advocate for. And we welcome the actions by the Global Women's Network for Energy Transition, the Clean Cooking Alliance, and Sustainable Energy for All that are already working towards these goals through their mentorship program of young women starting their careers in the clean energy sector. However, within Energia, we also advocated that the work environment needs to be favorable for women, that women tend to enter, but they're not retained and they don't advance because the work environment is so, is not favorable to them. So having family-friendly human resource policies and working hours, very strict policies on sexual harassment. Energia's evidence has shown an intolerable level of sexual harassment in a lot of our energy institutions, as well as the need to deal with women's safety and mobility. We have been working on this through our partnerships with some of our partners, such as utilities like the Nepal Electricity Authority and Kenya Power. Another key issue that is coming up is that is not being addressed by any of the just transitions, at least from Energia's perspectives, is the millions of jobs of women in Sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia in the informal sector. For instance, women that are selling charcoal, that are procuring charcoal and selling firewood. The current just transition pathways do not address how these, as we are transitioning to a more formal green economy, how are we going to ensure that the jobs that are going to be lost in these areas are going to happen? And this is real. Currently, a lot of our governments in countries like in Tanzania that I'm speaking to you from, but also in Kenya and in Rwanda, are moving to, for instance, LPG. They're banning charcoal production and they're moving to other forms of clean energy. And these, unfortunately, these policies have a timeline that is decided on today and needs to be implemented tomorrow. So there's really a case to be made of what is going to happen to the millions of jobs of women in the informal sector, still in the biomass sector, that needs to be dealt with. A fourth element of a just transition, we feel, is the enabling policy and market environment. Within Energia, where evidence has shown that women are unrepresented in political and regulatory energy decision-making processes, and policymakers, like Bridget said, often lack knowledge about gender issues. We have been supporting national governments to develop such policies, but also local authorities as well. Kenya is a very good example of this. In 2019, there was a milestone in that they had the first ever gender in energy policy of any government at the ministerial level on the continent. This policy has been further translated and operationalized into action plans by other government agencies and also by local government authorities. This provides a very good practice of how we can actually engender an energy policy, the energy policy environment. For Energia, however, it moves beyond that. We have been working with women's saving and credits groups to transform these into grassroots associations that can leverage their collective agency to negotiate, to lobby, and to influence energy decision-making spaces and policies in the policy and regulatory landscape and the markets that they operate in. So it is working together with the women's groups and transitioning them to be formal political collective hubs that that women can use as a platform to advocate for their rights. Finally, we're very clear that a gender-just transition must employ a gender justice accountability framework in which we have to collect sex disaggregated data and monitor gender-specific indicators in all energy and climate transitions, climate transition interventions. And this will allow us to build evidence on what the gaps are and also make decisions on what are good progress based on the this data. As we prepare we've only got 5.5 years before we're supposed to have achieved the SDGs. So looking beyond that, Energia is absolutely clear that we cannot have another energy sustainable development agenda without a clear indicator on gender. And so we are working towards what's going to be the Summit for the Future, where heads of states are going to start thinking about a post-2030 agenda to build consensus and to get political buy-in on a gender indicator for a post-energy sustainable development agenda post-2030. But the next 5.5 years, there are other critical moments on the SDG calendar, but also in the climate challenge calendar, where I think it's a time for transformative partnerships, such as those convened by Shine Collaboration, but also the Gender and Energy Compact, to come together and to influence intergovernmental processes. This is not just under the UN, but we're thinking about the G20 is also another area that is really of importance and really influences what these transition pathways, and feminists need to, we need to continue to convene and to voice and to influence these. And this is why webinars such as the one that Shine is hosting, this and the next series that I think you're going to announce, it becomes so important to really position a feminist perspective on just and inclusive energy transition. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sheila. It's very hard to break in because you have so much richness and experience in this area. And thanks for really bringing investors into the conversation more, and local businesses, ways to resource local renewable energy companies that are women-led, and it's such a critical piece of how we build the new economies of the future, right? And the challenge that women are primarily located in the informal economy in many countries, and so are left out even when labor unions are included as part of the just transition process and conversation, as they have in the case of South Africa. And new possibilities for alliances and spaces. So last, but really definitely not least, and probably the person that has taught me a lot about energy justice is Jackie Patterson, who is the founder and director of the Chisholm Legacy Project, and really recognized most recently by Time Magazine for her long time really pioneering in environmental and climate organizing grounded in a racial and gender justice approach, who's worked with so many communities across the world, and really navigating the building the connection between community organizing and policy advocacy and technical know-how in ways that center justice. So Jackie, over to you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. It's a joy and an honor to be here with the Shine family and everyone who's interested in hearing more about this framing and this work. And thank you for that introduction. The last introduction I had to my remarks indicated that I was going to speak about something very different than what I had planned to speak about. So it caused great panic. So now I'm very braced. Anyway, I'll keep it short because I know we're short on time as well. So I'll just kind of summarize in less than the time that was originally allotted. So a few years ago, I was asked to speak by one of our funders. It was a foundation that's focused on supporting energy projects. And they asked me to speak to a group of solar developers and solar developers, solar installers, and to really just talk about the intersection, not the intersection so much as, but to talk about energy as a justice issue. And so we were asked to give our slides in advance, and I did. And then they came back and they were like, yeah, we're looking at the slides and we really need you to just focus on energy. They were just like, these slides are, they have a lot of stuff in here, and these are solar developers, so we really need you to focus on energy. And I said, oh, okay. And so then I said, okay, I just eliminated the slides altogether and renamed my presentation Black Lives Matter, the NAACP mission, and energy democracy in these times. And then went on to kind of say exactly what I was planning to say before without slides. And at the end, it weaved together gender justice, racial justice, energy, climate, and how it was all inextricably interconnected. And at the end, the folks came back not only during the session, but even reached out to me afterwards and said it really brought meaning to their work in a way that they never considered before. And it brought meaning not only to the work that they were doing, but connection to their communities and their lives in a way that they hadn't considered before. And this is the magic of kind of multi-solving approaches and the magic of understanding intersectionality as a way to move this work forward in such a much more impactful, systems changing way. And so I've seen so many examples of how that worked, from the offshore wind bill in Maryland, which was really just stalling, just faltering in its progress, as they had traditional environmental organizations that were advocating for it. They really couldn't get others on board. And then someone really got the clue that they needed to ask people, what would it take for them to support some of these organizations? What would it take for you to support this offshore wind bill? And people had different answers. And one of the civil rights groups said that it would take for it to actually mean something to the communities that we work with. We would need to have a specific carve out for disadvantaged business enterprises, meaning women-owned, Black-owned, people of color-owned businesses. And so as they began to weave into the language of the legislation, the interest of the people who they were seeking to have advocate for, they then had a more robust bill and got a coalition behind it. And and together they were able to swiftly and successfully pass that bill. I think of the Future Energy Jobs Act in Illinois, where it was the same thing, but they were smart. And from the beginning, they really brought together a multifaceted coalition of gender justice groups, of labor groups, of groups of returning citizens, people who were formerly incarcerated. And they put together a comprehensive bill that really recognized the various needs and interests of the community. I think of some projects that resulted from such leadership, like the Genesee Center for Domestic Violence Prevention and Intervention, where they discovered, they determined that energy was one of their more exhaustive, or bigger bills that they have to pay. And so we had a conversation with them about moving to solar. And we're able to get, from the United Methodist Women and other groups to come together and fund a solar array on the transitional housing for the Genesee Center for Domestic Violence Prevention and Intervention. And so not only did they have this solar that was enabling them to then repurpose the money that they were putting towards energy towards deeper programming, but in a partnership with Homeboy Industries, which is an organization that was developed to train formerly incarcerated persons on doing solar installations and energy efficiency. Those same folks actually trained the women who are residents in the transitional housing, women whose families were escaping from domestic violence, on how to actually do the solar installations. And so they got up on their own rooftop of their transitional housing and installed their solar panels, and they learned the craft and did it in other places until soon each and every one of them was liberated from being in transitional housing, were able to get their own housing because they had jobs in the solar industry thanks to the skills transfer. So it was a very epitome of multi-solving. You got greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere from, now getting energy through solar. It enabled the repurposing of money that was going towards energy to go towards deeper programming, and women who were really trapped by financial circumstances with their abusers, but then free to then be in this transitional housing so that they can get their lives in a place where they can be financially independent. We're able to gain that financial independence, be free from their abusers, and have a long-term employment and economic stability for themselves and their families. And so it was a beautiful thing. I'll give just another example because I want to make sure we have enough time for questions and answers. But we did a certification program on energy justice. It was and so through that energy justice certification program, there are two people who came through. One person who said actually she herself was interested in becoming an energy justice champion because she herself had gotten into financial arrears and had her electricity turned off for non-payment time and time again. And every time they turned it off, they applied these penalties to her. And then they made her pay a deposit in order to get her energy back on. So she just got further and further in the hole until she decided that she was going to, instead of continuing to just throw good money after bad, as they say, that she actually just started to save away that money. And every time she got a critical mass of money, she would buy a solar panel. And then every time she got a critical mass of money, she would buy another solar panel until she had a whole array. And meanwhile, she just got a cooler and kept her cool things in the cooler and bought ice every day as well. But she lived in Phoenix, which is one of the hottest places I've ever been to. And I've been on the equator and I wasn't as hot as I was when I was in Phoenix. And so I don't know how she even managed that. But anyway, once she got an array, she actually was an electrician. So she used her own, they say journeyman, but journeywoman's electrician license, got up on her roof and installed her own solar panels. And later on, after we started working with her, she wrote an article, "Utility greed locked me out of the grid, but God-given sun set me free." And it was so very true. So I could give example after example after example how these multi-solving approaches, for her, it was having the skills that she needed to then again reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but have for herself financial independence from these companies that didn't care one whit about her well-being when they would shut off her energy when she needs it the most. So as I fast forward to recently, I was on a tribunal on public health impacts of the oil and gas industry, and they were talking, people from Uganda to Mozambique to South Africa to the Niger Delta were talking about the impacts of the Shell and Total Energies on their communities. They talked about the poisoning of the water, the livelihoods lost, the flooding and the climate change that resulted from kind of the change in the topography as they did the development for the oil and gas. They talk about violence and massacres that they experienced and displacement and death. But the very people on the call who were talking about the various projects from Malawi to South Africa to Zimbabwe and so forth, these women-led projects, people-led projects on energy are the solution. It's not a matter of us not needing energy. It's a matter of doing energy in a way that has safety, that has security, that builds financial impact financial stability and wellness for a community, and we can have both energy and we can have wellness. And so the example that were shared before proved that it doesn't have to be the way these tragic stories in the Niger Delta in Mozambique and South Africa in that tribunal were. So hopefully, this kind of makes a sense in terms of the multi-solving strategy and the interconnections between gender justice, racial justice, and energy justice. And so I look forward to our Q&A to discuss more. Thank you so much. Back to you, Lisa.
Thanks so much, Jackie. And I love this, that God-given son set me free is just such a powerful sort of message for this whole webinar. And, really closing out with the connections between how negatively impacted so many communities and the planet has been that you talked about in your experience with the oil and gas tribunals, to the examples of really building the possibility of local economies where energy and wellness are tied together, and energy is a tool and a catalyst that people can use and control to determine the future more, I think is a fantastic way to close these presentations. And so thank you to all of you. We have some juicy questions in the Q&A, which I encourage you to look at as we close out and spend the last 15 minutes hearing a round of brief comments from each one of you in maybe 3 to 4 minutes that respond to some of these questions and kind of build on what you've heard from each other. And I just want to flag, there's a question about Shell cleaning up the environment, and what about the health risks to women that are lasting. Jose Antonio suggests that cultural transformation be added to the financial mechanisms and technical capacity. It's such a good point. And how can women and girls participate at all levels in addressing these challenges? And thank you to Lindy for more examples from EarthLife Africa on how folks are navigating and working at the community level during load shedding, and how women have gained confidence from the Educate and Empower Women on Renewable Energy program. And a couple more questions here at the end: how to address gender disparities in access to energy and mining resources, a question about clean cooking and cook stoves as a way of reducing reliance on fuel wood. And can we keep the chat enabled so that everyone can access the documents? We will be following this up, by the way, with more information and documents from our speakers with connections to the work of these amazing partners. And we'll follow up with more in the webinar series, where in the next webinar, for example, we'll really focus much more on the energy piece of this. What does it mean to work in the world of energy and have access to renewable technology? And what does that take? So with that, I want to hand it over to the speakers to build on each other's comments briefly and close us out. Anyone ready to jump in?
Maybe I should try, because I think that'll be much shorter. Thought about that. I just want to say that I think the way when we're making points, it is clear that there's still much more to challenge. We still have to challenge what is assumed as power, because we have the power ourselves, but then because of other material conditions, we are seen as being powerless. The comment that I would also want to make is around mining. The question around how can women be empowered around mining. I think the first question that I would ask is what kind of mining, what mineral is being mined, and what does that, what is the benefit of that, and whether the community or the women there are saying, yes, we agree to mining of this mineral in our land, because the issue of mining is related to land ownership. And in many communities, we know that women are the ones who are the custodians of land, and they're the custodians of cultures. And if mining is being done, their dignity most of the time is being eroded. And it's not only mining on land, it's also mining in our oceans. So I would say that this is something that we have to look into, because there may be not a need for continuously mining. What can now happen is to see what we can repurpose, what we can reuse, because we have a lot of commodities around us, but we still want to continue mining. So for the alternatives, that's what we need to consider, because a transition, it's also about preserving our biodiversity. Transition, it's also about mitigating climate change and adapting to the realities that we find ourselves in. Thank you.
Go ahead, Bridget.
I'll just jump in really quick on 2 points of this. One, on participation, there's obviously multiple levels I think that folks can be engaged in. And I just wanted to say, if engaging in global policy spaces is something that seems like an entry point for you to be engaging with governments or investors, there is a robust women and gender constituency engaged in the UN climate change negotiations that really tries to be that bridge between the policy process and advocates. And so I can share with this group those links if folks want to be involved there. There's multiple ways in which we're trying to enhance participation. And then the last piece was just, it spoke to me so much when Jackie was talking about how she was able to bring the lived experience to why energy is not just energy, it's everything. And I think we always have to be working at these nexus and making these connections to folks who really, practitioners, to donors who exist in the silos that they work in, because not only is this so critical for the lived realities of just transition or justice on an everyday, but what we're seeing consistently happening where we're seeing right-wing authoritarian policies being enacted in communities and in countries, there's often this deep link to policies that are being put in place from a top-down perspective that are not taking deep consultation and consent into account. And some of them are being done in the name of climate. Some of them are being done in the name of sustainable development, whether that's taxation or subsidies that get put in place on people, on farmers, on communities. And we're not going to win in that way. We're not going to achieve a just transition. So energy justice and gender just energy justice is really critical to all forms of democracy as well. I'll leave it at
that. Maybe I'll just come in and build on what I actually cannot see the questions in the chat because I dropped off. My connection got lost a few times, so when you come back, the chat was not there. But there was one question on clean cooking that I did send a response to. I think it was a question of how to get affordable clean cooking to women living in remote areas in a particular country. I would like to just share my email address, and please get in touch with me because they are organizations and groups that are working on this. Maybe what could be one of the countries that energy is working in, or like I said, other Shine partners that would be able to put you in touch with. But building on what Bridget has said about participation, I think more than ever, the time is now that really the women's movement, the feminist movement, really need to convene and to strategize and be heard, not just on the climate space, but also on the SDG space. And it's through the Women's Major Group could be one, but I think there's so many different avenues. Too often, those of us who are working in the energy sector don't necessarily meet and greet and speak to our brothers and sisters and others in the
Oops, Sheila, did we lose you? Maybe Sheila's in Tanzania with uncertain connection, obviously, an energy justice issue for this webinar. Maybe while we're waiting for her, another speaker could share comments.
Maybe I can jump in. There is a question on how can we ensure the climate financing and resources allocation prioritize gender equality and women's empowerment. Let me just say that this is why we are talking about, climate and energy being a gender issue. It is an issue that does not affect women equally. And therefore, when there is allocation of climate finance, what we need to tackle is the issue of power. I think John and Lisa have spoken about the issue of power. How do we make sure that we start deconstructing power? How do we address structural violence, the violence that is systemic and is perfected in the institutions, in the laws, in the cultures, and in the economic policies? That needs to be deconstructed, because for us to just say we are going to do 50-50 on paper, it does not make sense if we do not disrupt the cultural institutions, the economic institutions that continue to perpetuate gender injustice in their systems. And there is also the question that came up about the issue of energy access. How do women access clean energy to impact climate change? For me, the issue of energy access, when we talk about the issue of energy access, it speaks to some conceptualizations and definitions which say that people have access, when in reality, the same people who are purported to be having access are living in energy poverty. Because let us look, for example, in South Africa, energy access is very high, but the affordability of that, of the unaffordability of electricity makes a lot of communities live in energy poverty. The same in Zimbabwe, where we have 20% of rural areas being electrified, but we all know that 98% of the people in Zimbabwe's rural areas are living in energy poverty. And therefore, I think what Lisa mentioned when we were just starting, that how about making energy access a right, not a privilege for a few? Because if we would push for energy to be a right, then it means the issue of affordability falls off, and ensuring that the wording actually makes it a right in reality. And of course, addressing all these systemic barriers to women's access. If we stop normalizing gender poverty amongst women, then we could be heading towards women having access or addressing energy poverty. Thank you.
We have a couple minutes left. Jackie.
Super briefly. So I also wanted to just quickly, sorry to be redundant, to address the climate finance very quickly and uplift Mariama Williams, who we're fortunate to have as a consultant, but she also is an amazing scholar on the intersection of gender equality and climate finance. And she specifically wrote a book on a gender and climate change financing, but she also is just a very accessible resource in and of herself. She also wrote a paper on shaping the future of multilateralism, just and sustainable finance to address multiple global crises demands a gender equality focus. And so just wanted to point that out. And then also just as a small anecdote that I was going to share before, but to Sister Mela's point around building power, one of the folks that we had in our energy justice certification program went from participating in the energy justice program to developing a set of principles around climate justice, to developing a model policy on called the Portland Clean Energy Fund, to based on her leadership in advancing that Portland Clean Energy Fund in Portland, Oregon. She gained a level of notoriety and leadership in her community. She became the first Black woman on city council for the city of Portland, Oregon. So this is the key in terms of gaining this level of leadership. And it was a people-led piece of legislation. It was the first people-led piece of legislation and the first kind of people-supported city council person as this Black woman on city council. And so it shows kind of the possibilities of building power and influence. So thank you.
John, we haven't heard from you. Do you have one last thing to say? And then I can close us out and thank our webinar participants. You're unmute.
What a great panel. I've learned a lot, but I have two quick things to say if I can. First, this question about Shell and leaving, trying to clean up the environment. Unfortunately, they aren't trying to clean up the Delta. They're trying to leave the Delta now. They're closing down, they're exiting Nigeria and leaving the cost to other people. And that's why we've got to hold the companies responsible for the past, as well as thinking about the future. That's happening everywhere, including the companies going bankrupt who've destroyed the land, and now they no longer have the market, so they're leaving the cost to everybody else. But secondly, to Jose Antonio's question about, yes, this is a cultural issue. We have to go back and look at how, particularly in the West, the huge amount of money that the fossil fuel industry has spent to shape our ideas of what a good lifestyle is like, which kinds of cars we should drive, what kind of clothes we should wear, what kind of food we eat, all of which depend upon fossil fuel-based derivatives. The amount of money they spend now on advertising and narrative building is huge. And the more they are challenged, the more they're trying to shape our cultural choices. So we have to fight back on the narrative as well, not just on their political and economic and environmental decisions, but the way they're trying to shape our minds and our values. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, John. And thank you on behalf of Shine to all these wonderful partners in this incredible conversation. And I really appreciate the closing remarks in reminding us that a transition really is still dealing with an extractive economy and all the damage left behind and the resources needed for that and the people's engagement, community engagement for that, even as we're rebuilding and building a regenerative economy for the future. And that this is a democracy question. This is a question of deep participation and collaboration in ways that we haven't collaborated between advocates and community organizers, between investors and philanthropic funders, technical people, and know-how. And so we really invite you to follow us in the webinars to come through the Shine Collaborative, where we really are trying to build this kind of radical collaboration to make energy access and control a real tool for a much more transformational just transition. So thanks all. And stay tuned for more and follow up.
Everyone can come off mute and say goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Bye. Thanks so much, everybody.
Bye-bye.
That was
Thank you.
great. So great.
Thank you.
Bye.